What you're watching is not just troop movement, it is pressure becoming visible. And that matters because when pressure becomes visible, most people make the same mistake. They argue about the headline and miss the machine. Was it 1,000 troops? More? Less? Is it a bluff, a warning, a routine deployment, a pre-war signal? Those questions matter, but they are not the first question. The first question is, what stage are we in? Because by the time the public sees air defenses moving, aircraft repositioning, and forward deployments near Iran, the story is usually not starting. It is already deep into motion. What looks sudden is often the final visible layer of a much older process. Debt pressure, choke point pressure, alliance pressure, political deadlines, and military signaling all locking together until escalation stops feeling like a choice and starts behaving like an output. That is why this moment matters. Reuters has reported U.S. planning for potentially sustained operations against Iran if ordered, and other reporting has described a major regional buildup of U.S. aircraft and assets while diplomacy continues. At the same time, the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical energy choke points in the world, with roughly 20 million barrels per day moving through it in 2024 and early 2025, about 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Add to that a highly leveraged global system. Reuters cited IIF data showing global debt near $346 trillion in Q3 2025, roughly 310% of global GDP. That means this is not just a military story, it is also an oil story, an inflation story, a shipping story, an insurance story, and a political survival story at the same time. So no, the real question is not whether one headline got the troop count exactly right. The real question is whether the system has entered compression. Because if you learn the pattern, you stop reacting to headlines like they are random. You start reading the structure before the release. And the pattern is brutally simple. It has 4 stages: strategic concentration, overextension, compression, release. That is it. And once you see it, you will start seeing it everywhere. First comes strategic concentration. A narrow point becomes too important to ignore. A strait, a border, an alliance frontier, a reserve currency channel, a supply route. More and more outcomes begin to depend on fewer and fewer nodes. At this stage, elites call it stability because the system still appears to function. But underneath, resilience is already shrinking. The system is becoming efficient and fragile at the same time. Then comes overextension. This is where actors stack commitments on top of that strategic concentration. Bases, security guarantees, sanctions, proxy networks, debt issuance, domestic promises, prestige claims. The public sees strength. The system is actually losing flexibility. Every new commitment is sold as temporary, but the liabilities accumulate. Overextension is not just spending too much or deploying too much. It is the loss of maneuver room disguised as power. Then comes compression, the stage most people misunderstand. Compression is when everyone says they are preventing war while taking steps that make accidental escalation more likely. Missile defenses move forward. Aircraft reposition, naval assets spread out, rhetoric hardens, deadlines appear, insurance costs rise, diplomacy continues publicly while military planning accelerates privately. No one wants to look weak, so every player narrows their own off-ramp. Then comes a release. Not always total war. That is important. The release can be a limited strike cycle, a shipping attack, a blockade threat, a sanctions rupture, a market shock, or a domestic political event that forces action. The form changes, and the mechanism does not. A tightly coupled system under repeated stress discharges somewhere. Now here is the part most people resist. Once a system enters compression, the sentence "nobody wants war" loses a lot of predictive power. It is often true, and still not enough. Most escalations do not happen because leaders suddenly become irrational cartoon villains. They happen because each actor is trying to avoid a worse outcome while defending credibility inside a system with shrinking room to maneuver. The danger is not evil intent. The danger is tight coupling. Let me prove the mechanism quickly, because the point is not memorizing history. The point is recognizing architecture. Before World War I, Europe looked stable to many people on the surface. Trade was deep. Great powers were experienced. Diplomacy existed. But strategic concentration had formed around alliance blocks, mobilization systems, and credibility. Peace depended less on trust, and more on the belief that mobilization speed could preserve deterrence. Then came overextension, hardened alliances, rigid war plans, imperial obligations, prestige politics, and assumptions that hesitation would invite future weakness. After Sarajevo, diplomacy did not vanish, it intensified. Notes, ultimatums, meetings, debates, politicians still acted like politicians. But the system started moving like a machine. Mobilization timetables compressed time, and once the diplomatic clock and military clock diverged, the military clock won. The release was not a carefully managed limited outcome. It was a catastrophe that far exceeded what many participants believed they were choosing at the start. Now shift to 1973 because this case shows that the release phase does not need to be only military. It can be economic and global. The setup was strategic concentration around Middle Eastern energy, feeding industrial economies. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, growth, transport, and inflation assumptions in advanced economies were increasingly tied to reliable energy flows. Then overextension, Cold War commitments, regional rivalries, domestic stress, and monetary instability all tightening together in one system. Compression arrived when war, superpower signaling, and emergency responses accelerated at the same time. The release was not just battlefield damage. It expressed through oil disruption, inflation, growth collapse, and the stagflation crisis that reshaped politics and economics across countries far from the front line. Regional trigger, global transmission. Then, 1990, 1991 in the Gulf, almost a laboratory example of the modern military version. Strategic concentration was obvious, a core energy region tied to global markets. Overextension was already in place. Debt burdens, regime pressures, militarization, and external security commitments no major power could ignore without cost. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, compression began immediately. Diplomacy and force buildup ran in parallel. Sanctions, coalition building, troops, armor, air assets, missile defenses, logistics, all assembled under the public language of deterrence and crisis management. That is what compression looks like in real time, talking about preventing war while building the infrastructure for war. Then release. A major campaign followed by a long afterlife of basing, sanctions, and unresolved regional consequences that shaped the next decades. The immediate crisis was solved, but the system was reloaded. 3 eras, different leaders, different ideologies, different technologies, same mechanism. Now look at the present through that lens. The strategic concentration is obvious. The current U.S. Iran confrontation sits next to one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a map detail. It is a price transmission channel for the global economy. Even if a disruption is partial or temporary, markets can reprice risk before physical shortages fully appear. That means escalation near Iran is not simply a regional security issue. It can move oil expectations, freight, marine insurance, inflation psychology, and policy choices far beyond the Gulf. Overextension is also visible, and this is where people become ideological and stop being analytical. Overextension is systemic, not moral. The United States is balancing alliance credibility, regional deterrence, domestic political pressure, and global market consequences while trying to preserve flexibility. Iran is balancing regime security, sanctions pressure, strategic signaling, and regional networks under sustained external pressure. Both sides operate inside a world economy already strained by high debt and fiscal limits. That combination matters. And when debt is high, shocks become harder to absorb cleanly. And that brings us to compression, which is the stage that matters most right now. Compression has a very specific signature. Public messaging and operational behavior start telling 2 different stories at the same time. Publicly, leaders say they want deterrence and diplomacy. Operationally, they build options. Reuters reporting on U.S. preparations for potentially sustained operations if ordered, alongside reports of expanded deployments and positioning, fits that signature. This does not prove a war is guaranteed. It proves the system is increasing readiness while diplomacy remains in play. And that is exactly why compression is dangerous. The same actions meant to strengthen deterrence can also reduce decision time and narrow off-ramps if a trigger appears. So, when someone says, this is just another deployment, ask a better question. Is this symbolic posture or layered readiness? That distinction matters more than the headline number. A symbolic move sends a signal. Layered readiness creates optionality. And optionality is not just troop count. It is integration, mobility, protection, logistics depth, command and control, missile defense, strike capacity, and the ability to absorb retaliation. When those layers begin to appear together, the system is not merely speaking. It is preparing to act if the trigger comes. And the trigger is often smaller than people expect. 1 strike, 1 militia attack, 1 shipping incident, 1 misread radar track. 1 deadline expiring while forces are already in place. In compression phases, small events can produce large consequences because the system is primed to convert friction into action. This is also why several common comfort lines fail. Nobody wants war. Often true. Still weak as a forecast once compression is advanced. Markets will force de-escalation, sometimes, but markets can also harden positions by repricing risk faster than political systems can adapt, especially when leaders fear backing down now creates a larger strategic cost later. Technology will keep it controlled, maybe tactically, But technology changes the speed and form of release, not the structural pattern. Precision weapons, drones, ISR, missile defense, cyber tools, and AI-assisted targeting may reduce some uncertainty while creating new pressure through faster detection, faster reactions, and shorter political decision windows. We have heard versions of this before. Before 1914, many believed deep economic interdependence made major war irrational. It did not stop the release. In the 1970s, many trusted advanced economic management to absorb energy shocks. It did not prevent stagflation. In later interventions, many believed precision warfare would guarantee controlled outcomes. Sometimes it delivered rapid battlefield success while failing to control second-order effects, new tools, old mechanics. So what should a smart viewer do with this analysis? First, stop asking only, will war happen? That question is emotionally understandable but analytically late. It treats the release as the only event worth tracking. A better question is, where is the system in the sequence? Is the strategic node obvious? Are commitments layered beyond easy rollback? Are military and diplomatic tracks accelerating in parallel? Are public off-ramps narrowing because no side wants to look weak? Are markets, shipping, and insurance starting to price disruption? If multiple answers are yes, you are likely in compression. And compression means prepare for volatility, not certainty. That preparation looks different depending on who you are. If you run a business, track energy, logistics, insurance, and policy signaling as one dashboard, not separate headlines. If you work in supply chains, build contingency assumptions before disruption becomes visible in delivery times. If you invest, watch not only spot prices, but narrative shifts around duration, retaliation risk, and policy response. If you're simply trying to stay informed, train yourself to distinguish triggers from causes. The trigger is what the news flashes. The cause is the pressure the system has been storing for months or years. And above all, stop rewarding analysis that treats every escalation as a surprise. A lot of surprise analysis is just pattern blindness with confidence. You do not need to predict the exact trigger to understand the phase. You do not need perfect intelligence to notice compression. And you do not need to be a military planner to see when deterrence language and operational behavior begin drifting apart. That is the edge, not prophecy. Pattern recognition. Now let me be precise about what this analysis is not saying. It is not saying war is guaranteed tomorrow. It is not saying every deployment becomes invasion. It is not saying diplomacy is fake. It is not saying one actor alone controls the outcome. It is saying something more useful. When strategic concentration, overextension, and compression align inside a highly indebted global system, the cost of misreading the stage rises sharply. That is why the current buildup around Iran matters, even if no shots are fired tonight, because the consequences are not limited to the battlefield. In a world carrying extreme debt and stretched public finances, even temporary disruption near a major energy choke point can ripple through inflation expectations, freight pricing, insurance premiums, growth forecasts, and domestic politics far from the region. The choke point is regional, the transmission is global, and that is exactly why shallow takes fail here. If you focus only on troop count, you miss integration. If you focus only on rhetoric, you miss logistics. If you focus only on ideology, you miss incentives. If you focus only on the trigger, you miss the pressure. The system does not care about our preferred narratives. It responds to constraints. So do not memorize the headline. Memorize the mechanism, strategic concentration, overextension, compression, release. Once you learn to see those four stages, the world starts to look less random. Not necessarily safer, but less random. You can spot when leaders still have room to maneuver and when they are mostly managing consequences inside a narrowing corridor. And that matters, because timing is the hidden variable almost everyone ignores. The biggest mistake ordinary people make is waiting for certainty from institutions that only become certain after the release starts. By then, prices have moved, narratives have hardened, and options are worse. You do not need panic. You need a framework. A framework helps you stay calm while others swing between denial and doom. A framework helps you ignore noisy headlines and track the variables that actually transmit stress. A framework helps you avoid confusing no escalation yet with no escalation risk. And a framework helps you prepare early when preparation is still cheap. So the next time you see emergency diplomacy, missile defense repositioning, aircraft surges, and limited options under review, do not ask only, who is bluffing? Ask, what stage is the system in? If it is still in setup, there is room. If it is in overextension, flexibility is shrinking. If it is in compression, time is no longer your friend. And if the release begins, your job is no longer prediction. It is response. That is the point of this analysis. Not to scare you, to train your eyes. Because the most dangerous stories are not always the ones that arrive without warning. They are the ones that advertise their pattern in public, while most people are still arguing over whether the first visible move really means anything. It usually does. And right now, around Iran, the pattern is visible enough that dismissing it as routine is not serious analysis. The combination of choke point exposure, military option building, diplomatic pressure, and fragile financial conditions makes this a system event, not just a regional headline. Maybe the release is diplomatic under pressure. Maybe it is a limited strike cycle. Maybe it is an economic shock without prolonged war. Maybe an off-ramp appears at the last moment. Those outcomes are different, but they all belong to the same machine. So do not memorize the troop count. Memorize the stage. Because once you can read the stage, you stop chasing the news and start understanding the forces that move it. And that is how you protect your attention, your decisions, and your timing before the release becomes obvious to everyone else.